Hello everyone, welcome. Right, so I'm going to talk about a pact between, down in the 1930s, between the Third Reich, I'm going to avoid the name as far as I can, and the Zionists. I have come across a book by a Spanish historian which is called this pact, the Havaara Pact. Have you heard of it? I hadn't. And so I was interested. I'm going through it, and I also saw an interview with this historian. His name is Ivan Gómez-Avilés. He's a Spanish historian. And I'm trying to bring you from time to time things that are written or interviews that are written in other languages, because you might not come across them, they might not come up in your feed, and it's just something that I think you might be interested in. I do the opposite in my Spanish channel. I usually bring to them information that they might, in the English-speaking world, that they, is not by very, very famous people, and they might not have heard it. So I'm going to talk about this. It's a very interesting history of what happened, and I'm going to follow. I'll give you the information of the historian and the interview and everything down below in the description. Okay. For the names and everything else, and also the link if you want to follow it. But it starts with the interviewer saying that the year 2022 we were able to see as a moment when we saw clearly, finally perhaps, a certain link that we couldn't quite figure out between Nazism and Zionism. Why? How and in what way? At that moment, when the conflict in which the Russian Federation confronted the NATO forces in Ukraine, we saw first how the Zelensky government in Kiev on the one hand was actually working with or sometimes financing groups like the Azov battalion, which we all saw on YouTube channels. They openly displayed Nazi symbols in their emblems and tattoos and so on. And on the other hand, that they were also quite close partners with Israel. In many ways, we wondered how can President Zelensky be aligned with these groups, with these forces? First, because he is, and we all thought, not all, but I certainly did think at the time, being Jewish himself, he must have felt quite uncomfortable working with people who had swastikas tattooed, but even so, how could he had he forgotten the whole suffering of the Holocaust caused and meant for the Jewish people? The whole suffering that they had to go through, and somehow be reunite, as it were, with these forces, working with them. I thought, well, perhaps, you see, he has no choice. If he doesn't do what they demand of him, well, perhaps, they could get rid of him in some way, or something along those lines. Well, I could see that he was perhaps in a situation sort of between a rock and a hard place, as the saying goes. But really, you can only be in that situation up to a point. At a certain point, I was wondering, when is he or his conscience, being Jewish, is going to demand, this cannot go on, or something along those lines. Well, therefore, let me go back to the not so distant history past, which speaks of a pact, an agreement between these two oppressive movements, and Zionism and Nazism, and how it all came to be. And I am referring here to the Havaara Pact, by means of which the Third Reich, or the Nazis and the Zionists, coordinated the extradition of German Jews to the land of Palestine. I will not go into, in this video, about the history of how the Zionist movement started in the late 1930s. One of the founders was Alexander Herzl. You probably heard of him by now. But there were others, and the discussions that the First Zionist Congress held where, among other things, they discussed where to create a state for the Jews who were at that time suffering discrimination. This is the end of the 19th century, okay? Herzl had been greatly influenced by the, he was a lawyer, by the Dreyfus Affair in France. The Dreyfus Affair, most of you have heard of it, where Dreyfus was accused of being a traitor in France, and it was probably very much to do, people felt, with anti-Jewish, or perhaps what we call now anti-Semite feelings, motivated anyway by a strong anti-Jewish antipathy. And the choices, they were trying to find a place where the Jews could live together. And believe it or not, it wasn't Palestine the first choice. As a matter of fact, they had thought of the Patagonia first, in Argentina. They thought of Uganda also was discussed. There was much debate about these two. But also Palestine, which was the favorite of some others, but not of Herzl himself, for reasons I will cover all this in another video. For Herzl, it was way down the list because, as he said himself in words that later were repeated by a British politician, the point was to find at that particular time a land without people for a people without a land. Those were his words. And Palestine, he felt, a lot of them saw that was already inhabited, it was full of inhabitants, it was for all intents and purposes closed for immigration. But the discussions continued, and as I said, I will leave that for another video, what happened later in the late 1920s. But let's start now with the 1930s. So, as I said, I have come across this book, the Havaara Pact, a pact between Nazis and Zionists. A book fully referenced with a lot of unknown or hidden or secret intrigues due to possible links that might have existed between these two movements. And as I said, I also found an interview with him, with this historian, from about a year ago, And it is in Spanish, but I have taken notes from this interview, and I'm going to share some of the main points of this interview with you, certainly the first half of the interview. So first, I will be reading through my notes if I can, because these are not my own ideas. It is not my work. I am just repeating other people's work, and it's only fair that I get it right. So I've been translating this. Okay, so first, the interviewer asks, what is the main argument of your book? What was this Havaara Pact? And he says, well, to begin with, it was a commercial agreement between the Third Reich and the German Zionist movement. When Hitler came to power and began to put siege, as it were, to put it that way, against the Jews, there came about a series of international reactions on the part of the Jews, calling everyone to boycott, and quite rightly to boycott, the German economy and German products. The German Zionists, let's say, opted for an alternative strategy, which was basically one of collaboration. In this way, he explains, it was like this. By the way, this pact, this agreement, was in force until 1939, the jure officially, but it really continued until, for the most part, until 1942. Now, Havaara in Hebrew means transfer. Let me get my notes. Okay, transfer of what exactly? So it involved a transfer both of people and of capital. It was originally devised by Sir Arnold, I think Arnold Talbot Wilson. Since the Germans had seized Jewish property, what this pact allowed was for the Jews who accepted this pact, through it they could emigrate to Palestine with part of their property, and in exchange the German Zionist movement would guarantee, in inverted commas, social justice, so that there would be a gradual departure of Jews and some others also outside of Germany. The interviewer asks, was there a specific amount of money spoken of here? He says, yes, there was. This is an interesting issue because, you see, it leads us to whether or not this pact was really a rescue of people operation or a rescue of capital operation to bring money to Palestine and found a Jewish state there at the expense of the Palestinian people, really. The British also, he adds, as well as the Palestinians, imposed certain restrictions when it came to emigrating. You had to have a minimum of £1,000 sterling at the time. This was quite a lot of money then. Not everyone had that amount of money to be able to emigrate. Therefore, what we do know is that the authorities of the British Mandate turned a blind eye and let in more people than the official quota allowed each year. They did not want to antagonize the indigenous Arabic population there that live within the mandate either. And another question is, okay, so let us go back then and situate ourselves, place ourselves historically there. The Second World War had not started yet. We are in the years immediately prior to it. We are at the moment when the Nazis when Nazism was still itself struggling with its own economy, which was not doing very well, to say the least. And on top of that, there was a boycott called from international Jewish organizations to boycott the German economy, not to buy German products. And this was quite effective. So, all right, the Third Reich looking to somehow, the historian says, oxygenate, to breathe some air into the German economy, found in this pact with Zionism a possibility by means of which those Jewish citizens who had a certain amount of money could emigrate to where was later was to become the State of Israel, but that state had not yet been created. But they could emigrate to Palestine. But a part of their money had to remain in Germany, in the coffers of the Third Reich government. That was the question. The interviewer says, did I understand this properly? Yes, exactly. I'm going to explain, Avilés continues, why this is in fact one of the key points of this agreement. Of course, the German economy was in the dumps. So to them, no way were they going to let the Jewish people emigrate with all their money and all their cash assets. So within the framework of the pact, the Jews who emigrated to Palestine under the auspices of this agreement, they could buy with their cash raw materials in Germany, pay for them, thus leaving the cash in Germany, and then they would emigrate to Palestine with those raw materials. And when there in Palestine, they would then sell those raw materials and thus recover part of their capital by paying the bank commission. Also, they would do that by paying a commission to an assigned bank, the one allowed to make these transactions. A curious point here is that one of the companies that benefited the most from this Havaara agreement was in fact a business conglomerate in the chemical industry, IG Farben, through a subsidiary. It was the company actually that marketed the Zyklon B Gas used in the Jewish genocide, the Holocaust. This company was formed in 1925. And then it broke up into three firms, AFGA, BASF and Bayer. Because it was really the Zyklon B Gas that was used in the gas chambers to exterminate the Jews, to exterminate them en masse, as it were. So here, continues this historian, you have what you might say, it's almost a real situation. This pact, an agreement between Jews and Germans, leads the Zionist Jews and Germans, leads to one of the most enriched companies out of this pact to be one of that, to be the one that produces the Zyklon B gas that served to exterminate millions of Jews. And this is, surreal, a first-class absurdity, to put it mildly. The interviewer says, why is this pact not known widely? The pact, everyone knows about the gas chambers, obviously, but the pact, is it something that is hidden, sort of secret? Is it considered a secret of sorts? And another question, why has it been so difficult to bring to light for many years now that the Nazis and the Zionists had collaborated, or let me put it this way, these were two movements that worked in parallel, as it were? And the answer is, it is perhaps an uncomfortable topic for the State of Israel. It is not something that is hidden or secret in some vault somewhere. No, actually, the question is not, is it hidden, if you're going to use that word, but rather, who hides it? Because it is well known in Palestinian sources and documentary literature, scientific literature. When you study these sources, the Havaara Pact is frequently mentioned, while in Zionist sources it is not. But let me, as an aside, highlight here the difference, he says, between Zionism and Judaism. It is not at all the same thing. To be Jewish or Judaism is a religion. Zionism is an ultra-internationalist or globalist movement that defends at all costs the existence of a Jewish state in Palestine, well, at the expense of the indigenous population that lives there, in my opinion, he says. This distinction must always be made, not to confuse Judaism with Zionism. Not all Jews are Zionists, and not all Zionists are Jews. There are Christians. I would add myself. Yes, look at the American Congress. Okay, so whoops. Sorry, trying to place the camera again. Okay, so also within Israel itself, this was about a year ago, 8 months ago, this interview, so the present problem had not started yet. But he says also within Israel itself, there are many dissident voices against what the state is doing against the indiscriminate behavior in the Palestine territory today. So to go back to what I was saying, he says, when you find the Havaara Pact mentioned in Zionist sources, it is always referred to as a rescue of people, never, and as also and mainly a rescue of capital. Zionist sources, most, either don't mention it at all, or simply, when they do, they refer to it as a, quote, successful operation to rescue people. Perhaps, he says, they are rather slightly embarrassed about it, or consider it shameful to talk about the political profit or benefit or the political capital that they got, actually, indirectly, perhaps from the Nazi Holocaust, which they used the Holocaust to try to shut up if you write about or say anything about the state of Israel, or they will call you anti-Semite and so on, he says. But I'm talking about numbers here only. In total, 60,000 Jews who could afford to emigrated, and compare that to the 6 million who were burned in ovens with this gas. The population who was rescued was, if you compare it in numbers, infinitesimal. So I don't know how they can refer to it now as a successful operation of rescuing people. The rich bought their way out. There is nothing wrong with that. I would have been the first online, I suppose. But they did not rescue. It was only an infinitesimal part. You cannot say that it was a successful operation of rescuing the Jewish people. But he adds, however, be very careful, because we have to be fair to here too. Let us remember, I need to highlight this point, that this pact was in force officially until 1939, and the Nazi final solution was not really implemented until the Wannsee Conference in 1942. So, to be fair here, this original Zionist movement most probably had no idea about what might happen, obviously, in the future, what was going to happen. A Holocaust of catastrophic magnitude. But what is also, to be fair to all sides in our assessment, he says, but what is also true is that by means of this pact, the German economy was revived, was able to breathe again to a large extent, and was able, above all, to endure this international boycott, to survive it. And all that heavy burden of the German economy that had been dragging the German economy along on its back since the First World War. Now, he continues, I mentioned 60,000 rescued, 6 million executed. That's about people, persons, individuals. In terms of rescued capital, important in many of the sources that I have consulted, he says, between 40 to 60%, because some sources differ from one another, between 40% and 60% of the circulating capital in the economy of the new Jewish-Palestinian economy at the end of the 1930s was channeled through the Havaara Pact. And this allowed the new Jewish settlers to have a clear advantage over the Palestinians. That is, it enabled them to acquire land, to buy weapons, to train militarily. Let us remember also that the land of Palestine was not in the hands of the Palestinian people living there. Before being under the British mandate, they had belonged to the Ottoman Empire. And this also meant that those Ottoman landowners sold to the highest bidder, and to the Jewish settlers were so the Jewish settlers were ahead, having more financing than the Palestinians. So this pact contributed also in this way to that inequality that ensued, to that disparity of power between the Palestinian and the Jewish people. Another question, according to the numbers you are giving me, the interviewer says, talking percentages only, we could say that the Havaara Pact saved, it seemed, 1% of the total Jewish German population. I would say the usual 1% in the society of any country. And it could be interpreted that at the same time Zionism, although, as you rightly say, and it seems historically correct to me, they had no idea of what was going to come in the future, in the concentration camps, they didn't seem to have cared much at first sight, he says, for the poorer Jews in Germany who could not afford the minimum of the £1,000. The historian says, unfortunately, no. Personally, when I compare Zionism and Nazism as political ideology, I always say, let me see if I can explain it, he says. Okay, I'm struggling with this. The Nazis made that selection of the Aryan race, and the Zionists made the choice of the most suitable. In fact, it is documented that a large part of the people, ordinary Jews who tried to benefit from the Havaara Pact, were in fact rejected. Many of those trying to flee. Therefore, it is another issue that shows that it was not a rescue of people, at least not just that, but a rescue of capital. The unit profiles were the capitalist profile, the person who had a minimum of £1,000 and could get a maximum of £4,000 in raw materials from Germany. Was that equivalent, say, the £1,000 to be able to buy a house or something like that? Oh, much, much more, he says. A house with a small plot of land at the time would be around £200, £300. It was enough to live a good life there. So the profiles chosen for this so-called rescue of people, of the Jews, to go to Palestine were first people with money, young people to work the land, young women to procreate, young men especially to work, to go to the army, to build the infrastructures, etc. It was a bailout of capital and a bailout of people. The interview continues for quite a lot longer, but I'm going to leave it there, just for you to. What I get from this part of the interview is that many of the Jewish people were trying to leave, and they were chosen according to certain criteria, and the criteria was money and whatever was going to be useful for Israel, but many were rejected. I also found interesting that so much of that money was invested in this particular company producing the Zyklon B Gas. It's a rather complex history, isn't it? I am now reading about the very beginning, the Dreyfus Affair, and the arguments that the founders of Zionism had between themselves. It's most interesting, because you're going to see there is a sort of a Zionist religious messianic approach from one side, and the other more practical one, which would become a political movement. And I find it all rather fascinating, and I'm sorry that I had never read about it or anything. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.